I got a question about the difference between Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 and Genesis 2:4 and following. So is there a discrepancy there? Someone had heard that from some of their friends that they believe there was a discrepancy between supposedly two creation accounts, the one from Genesis 1, verse 1 to verse 3 of chapter 2, and then the one that starts in verse 4 of chapter 2 and goes on through the end of chapter 2. So that's a fairly common view, not that there's a discrepancy necessarily, but that there's a difference. And you definitely have some differences between those two creation stories. However, I don't think that they contradict one another, but rather that they complement one another. Here's a statement from one of my professors that I appreciate. He said, "The record of the creation of man and woman in the garden is not another divergent tradition of creation. It is a rehearsing of the creation of man and woman that establishes their nature and place in God's world." And it goes on and talks about that some more. And I agree with that completely. I think if you read Genesis 1:1 through 2:3, and you recognize that is this beautiful poetic description of God's creation, that this is what God did. And then you recognize that there's a new structure that starts in verse 4 of chapter 2. And it says, this is the record of, and so on. You'll see that phrase repeated a lot in Genesis 1 or Genesis 2 and 3 and beyond, that he's simply zeroing in on that sixth day of creation, talking about God's creating Adam and Eve in the garden, and he focuses in on the beauty of that creation. So not a discrepancy, but rather a complementary relationship between these two creation, beautiful poetic stories of how God shaped the world.